Welcome to Calcast, your Create International podcast. God Network News, where we give you a new perspective
on events happening in our world today.
This is GNN.
This is God Network News, episode 175. Welcome, GNN fans, to another episode of God Network News, the podcast that tells you what God's doing around the world. Not what CNN tells you, but what GNN tells you is going on in the world. If you're tired of listening to all of that crisis network news and you want to hear what God's doing, well, give us a listen. Greetings, God Network News fans, to another great series that we'll be doing on movements. For these next few weeks, we've got some exciting podcasts that have been recorded by some colleagues of ours, all on the topics of movements, what makes movement leaders, what makes a movement, all kinds of exciting things. We're going to be focusing a lot on what God's doing in this season of missions, which is movements of peoples, whole people groups to Christ. There's amazing things happening, miracles everywhere. One of our organizations that we are partnering with, 2414, is already monitoring 1,360 movements. And each of these movements have over 56,000 new believers among them. And these are just amongst unreached people groups. So God is up to something really fantastic. And we're going to be looking into this in the next few weeks of our podcasts of God Network News. Portions of our podcasts will be made up of rebroadcasted podcast interviews from a friend of ours named Steve Addison. Steve Addison is a great podcaster and very passionate about movements of peoples to Christ. And Steve has his own podcast, very successful podcast with over 226 podcast episodes. And the name of his podcast is On the Road to No Place Left. And we highly recommend that you subscribe to his podcast because he has an overwhelming library of exciting topics related to movements. And if you want to learn more about movements, this is the place to find the information. And he has lots of training and tools and other resources that will really make your investigation of this topic successful. So we really want to thank Steve Addison and his partners there at movements.net/podcast. That's how you can find it, at movements.net/podcast, for all of the resources that he has given us for these next few podcasts. Thank you very much, Steve.
You know, I would characterize most movements as saying the people that are involved in movements have an apostolic passion and calling that I would say verges on the boundaries of desperation. They are so passionate for the people group that they are called to, that in most instances, they're going to be doing this regardless of whether there's money for it or not. They're going to find a way. So what I've generally found is that most movements actually, there's not a lot of money going around these things, but they're doing it anyway. And you find the insiders and the outsiders. Yes, I acknowledge, that the outsiders, the Westerners who are trying to help and trying to facilitate and trying to coach, they probably do have access to more finances. But these aren't the billionaires of the earth. These are people who are passionate about this particular country, this particular people group, and they're wanting to do everything they possibly can that's healthy and good, but also that's within the scope of their capabilities to help these people reach the unreached around them. And in a lot of instances, you have to be really pretty innovative because there's just not a whale of a lot of money going around to try to try to do things. And I think because there's not a lot of money going around, they have been led by the Spirit and through desperation into things that really don't cost very much, but are infinitely multipliable. You know, we don't film huge, we don't do huge video campaigns. We don't do satellite broad. And I'm not saying those things are bad, but without the resources for those things, you do what's available to you, and what's available to you is people share the gospel, people make disciples, people and teach others to do the same thing because they're desperate that people hear good news.
Yeah.
You know, so most of the people that I encounter really, they don't have access to a lot of money, but they're willing to pray and work right alongside everybody else. There are a fair number of teams, probably a large number of teams, even larger than what I'm aware of, who never see a movement start. So, you know, it could be just as simple as you've got a team of 2 or 3 people and they're placed on the field and they've been working to try to make a movement start. Somebody gets sick or somebody's kid has an accident or somebody's parents are ill for one reason or another, not moral failure, not money issues, not any of those kinds of things. Maybe their passports aren't renewed, maybe whatever. They have to come off the field and they didn't see a movement start. So there's a fair amount of that kind of thing because it takes a long time to see movements start. So you see teams, they get there, they sow and they don't see a movement start and they come off the field. Okay, that happens. Once you get to 4 generations, it's very rare that a movement will, I call it fizzle, implode. I have documented maybe 15 of those out of 1,300 that I've seen actually implode like that. Typically, it's not a recent event. Typically, the implosion, there's been 1 or 2 instances, I think, where it was moral failure in some of the leadership. There's been more instances where it was, and this was early on, there was unfortunately money, and then the money went away, and so the movement stopped. But in all 15 instances that I'm aware of, those believers, it's not like they went back to being whatever they were before. The believers are still there. And in most of the instances, in some instances, they absorbed into the traditional church that was there, but in some instances, but in most instances, what happened was the leaders that were involved in the movement started new movements. So new movements were birthed out of like I know of one movement that failed because money was gone, but that movement itself birthed 4 different movements that started up. They basically just multiplied it, split and multiplied is essentially what they did.
You're listening to God Network News Podcast with your host, Cal Curtis. Look up our website at godnetworknews.com.
I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. That's just what happened. And so the movements continue. So in most instances, when you get to 4 generations, it's not actually common for movements to implode. Now, what does happen quite frequently is a movement will get to the point of what I would call like stagnation. They will reach a point and they'll stop growing. And the typical reason for that is that they reach the natural boundary around them. It might be a political boundary. It might be a linguistic or a cultural boundary. Whatever it is, they've reached that boundary. And you have 2 choices at that point. You either, basically ossify into a network that functions like a house church, but is basically more like a traditional church, and that this is the scope of what you have. Or you are able to send workers over that boundary and see new growth and new things start. And there's a good number of movements that have done that, and many movements that are starting to hit that boundary, and some that haven't accomplished that. Getting over the cross-cultural boundary can be just as hard for people that are, in the field as it is for Westerners. It's not like, people in America, people in Europe find it more difficult, and people in Asia and Africa just go over those boundaries all the time. That's not true. It's difficult to get over that cross-cultural boundary, but that's really what has to happen if the movement's to grow. The natural barrier is typically around 100,000 people in most cases, it appears to be. Once you start getting up around 100,000, tens of thousands upwards toward 100,000, you have to start thinking about how are we going to go to the people next door? And that's something that is just as challenging for them as it is for us.
What sort of people is God looking for as catalysts for movements around the world?
One of the things we talk about is we try never to prejudge the field. We try never to prejudge a person, because we just don't know who is going to be a good catalyst and who's not. I will tell you that generally what we look for in a person who's going to be a field worker is someone who's willing to work in relationship with others, someone who's willing to be coached and to coach both, who's willing to pour their heart into other people, someone who's willing to both experiment and learn, someone who's a learner, someone who's really willing to obey, to do the things that need to be done in order to see fruit grow, and someone who's willing to count the cost and pay the inevitable price that will be paid, and deal with the fact that they probably won't get a lot of glory for what's going to happen. At no point in a traditional movement is there a lot of glory at any level. Yeah, I mean, you could be the national leader of a movement, but once you're beyond 4 generations, the people sort of downline from you, so to speak, they have no idea who you are. And they certainly don't know who the Westerner was that was helping out, and was serving this movement. So you got to live with the fact that there's not really going to be a lot of glory involved in this. And you got to deal with the fact that there's going to be a price to pay. There's going to be challenges and hardships and sicknesses and martyrs. And, you just have to cope with that reality. I would be looking for somebody who's entrepreneurial and has a passion, give me Scotland or I die kind of person. That's really who I would be looking for. But again, we try not to prejudge the field. Some of the best evangelists have been young people and old people who you wouldn't expect would have any ability or reputation. They're too new, they're too young, they're too old. They've got too many kids. They don't have enough kids. They're not married. They're business people. They're not business. We have all sorts of reasons for why somebody can't possibly be, and then they turn around and they end up being somebody who brings hundreds of people into the kingdom. It's just impossible to really tell.
So what sets them apart?
Most of the people that I've talked to that are catalysts, it's passion for the lost, a willingness to obey and do whatever God is calling them to do, and a high capacity to experiment and learn and try new things. The one of the folks that is in our organization, what they'll tell you is, we just get up in the morning and we pray and we listen, and whatever God tells us to do, that's what we do. It's for them, it's just that simple. It's just that straightforward. And I think, okay.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider donating to help us continue to bring exciting stories fresh from the field. Visit our website at godnetworknews.com and select the PayPal link on the right side of the page, or consider becoming a Patreon partner to receive access to more valuable materials exclusive to our members.